All right, friends and colleagues, welcome. I think we'll go ahead and get started, and I'm sure some other folks will join us in the coming minutes. Welcome, first of all. My name is Andy Perrin. I'm the director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities here at UNC Chapel Hill, as well as a professor of sociology here. And I'm thrilled to be able to welcome today someone whose work I've appreciated and learned tremendously from for a good number of years. It's wonderful to be able to invite her and have her join us virtually through the IAH Welcome Back Zoom Talks series. A couple of just pieces of background and information before we get started. The Institute for the Arts and Humanities, as many of you know, is the best place on campus, and now it's the best virtual place on campus at UNC. We seek to support, promote, and deploy artistic and humanistic scholarship and creativity in the service of outstanding knowledge, education, and public service. And during the time of the COVID pandemic, we've worked mostly to try to move as much as possible online and to keep going the great conversations that we are known for holding in Hyde Hall. We do hope and anticipate we'll be back energetically, provocatively back in Hyde Hall as soon as we can be. But until then, we're thrilled to be able to bring the conversation online through the Zoom Talks series. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me just tell you that we prefer, if you're able, that you keep your camera on so we can better simulate the sort of conversational atmosphere that we try to provide at the Institute. But of course, if you're not able or prefer not to have your camera on, that's fine. Please do keep your microphone muted unless and until you're called upon during the question and answer and comment section. We will make sure that there's plenty of time for questions and answers and comments. And when we do hold that section, feel free to either type your question or comment into the chat function or to request that you be recognized using either the chat function or the raise hand function in Zoom. All right, I'm thrilled to be able to introduce today Professor Sheila Jasanoff, the Forsheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and truly one of the pioneers of the field of science and technology studies. I think of her work in particular as the intersection among the public and publicity, science, technology, ethics, and democracy. And her work explores the role of science and technology in the law, politics, and policy of modern democracies. She's the author of many books and many articles as well, including most recently The Ethics of Invention, a really fascinating piece of work on the question of ethics within science and particularly in technology. I'm really looking forward to the conversation as she talks today, the title of the talk being Ignorance is Bliss, the Politics of COVID-19. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sheila Jasanoff.
Thank you so much, Andy, for the invitation. It's a little bit of a bittersweet experience because back when I lived in Ithaca, I had a very close friend at not Chapel Hill, but your other campus, NC State. And we used to have a sort of early exposure to spring by driving down from Ithaca to Research Triangle. And so I would much have preferred to be down there and seeing the place rather than up here at the end of a summer when we've all been immobile for far too long. But in any case, it's still lovely to see so many of you, and thanks for the opportunity to talk. I will put in a slight plug, Andy. There is a more recent book than Ethics of Invention, and it's called Can Science Make Sense of Life? And it's in a way a yet more humanistic tract, if you will. I mean, I think that my work more and more is veering toward trying to figure out what the new humanism of this century should look like when everybody seems totally determined to, wipe us off the face of the earth. And, the Anthropocene is the latest sort of buzzword that's making people decide that, you know, layers of lava are more important than us. So, you know, why bother thinking or writing at all is a question that comes back to mind. Anyway, so I hope that those bigger questions will be lurking in the background. But let me share my screen and talk about the politics of knowledge and non-knowledge that has sprung up, and put it in a bit of a wider context, and introduce some STS stuff as well while I'm doing that, and then hope for a really vigorous Q&A afterwards, because undoubtedly this will be very compressed for people who don't know anything of the kind of work that my colleagues and I have been doing in this area. So I'll begin by sharing the screen. I'll forewarn you that there are a couple of places where there are 2 short videos, and there'll be a little bit of a handoff. I want to thank Ebony and Ava for being incredibly dedicated support staff and helping me with this. So they will play the videos and I will recede, but that means we will share, unshare, reshare, and there may be a couple of small technical glitches at those moments. All right, so let's proceed from there and listen to my favorite person that I try not to listen to normally. So let me hand over to Ava for the video.
You know, if you're totally into that world, which I find to be very interesting. So supposing we hit the
No worries. Sheila, please just hit stop screen share.
Ultraviolet or just very powerful light. And I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets in the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me. So we'll see. But the whole concept of the light.
You know, there are all kinds of speeches that are called best political speeches of all time, but you know, this one probably has not yet risen to that status, but in a way it speaks to the moment that we're in, and I want to do something to contextualize it. I mean, if you live in the kind of community that I do and most of you do, the reaction is well known to you, but I think we need to complicate our set of reactions, and for that I think we need to take some steps backwards. So what are we confronting? I mean, so many people have said, you know, crisis of modernity, things that we held dear for so long have been abandoned. And of course, all of us are familiar with the ways in which people have spoken about truth in politics before, beginning with Hannah Arendt's frequently quoted words on this subject. So she talked about truth in politics, in which she understood the sort of phenomenon we've just seen. No one has ever doubted that truth and politics are on rather bad terms with each other, but that meant that there had to be other witnesses, so no permanence, no perseverance can even be conceived of without men, that's of course her word from back then, willing to testify to what it is and appears to them because it is. So that insistence on the verb is the thing that's been shaken. And I think that what I want to talk about is what the implications of that are, and also how we might sort of begin to think about putting things back together again, if that's what our interest is. So, you know, popular culture has picked up on this moment in all kinds of ways. The cartoon record is full of things to do with truth and post-truth. It's become a historical epoch. The word truthiness, it's now in the lexicon along with post-truth, this is all familiar stuff. What's less familiar maybe is that it predates the Trump administration in all kinds of ways. So in the sort of very recent past, even before the American election, people were talking about post-truth in connection with Brexit and the British election. And here is one interpretation by a British analyst. So the problem is the oversupply of facts in the 21st century. We might begin to wonder, what is meant by an oversupply of facts. How can that be the case? And there's a little bit of a sociological analysis of what that means. Too many sources, too many methods, varying levels of credibility, depending on who funded a given study and how the eye-catching number was selected. So for STS scholars, that sentence from there are too many down to was selected is a little bit analytically confused, because some of those points are stressing the point of production of knowledge, many sources and many methods. Others are addressing uptake and reception, so varying levels of credibility has to do with uptake. Funding, again, goes back to the production, and how the eye-catching number was selected straddles the line, because you don't know who's doing the selecting. Is it the person who produced the number, or is it people who want to stress particular kinds of numbers? And in the politics of COVID, you see a lot of this selectivity of numbers going on, and almost a daily barrage of numbers, but then a disagreement as to which numbers should we look at. Should we be looking at the fact that the number of diseases is rising, or the number of deaths falling? Has it got to do with the number of tests, or has it got to do with something else? So in that sense, the sort of public intellectual culture that's interpreting this production of facts is analytically all over the place. But this is the kind of thing that a lot of people are thinking. And as a result, of course, you have these famous showdowns, like the famous one with Mr. Giuliani, with the reporter on Meet the Press. And when you tell me that, so Giuliani says, when you tell me that, he should testify because he's going to tell the truth and he shouldn't worry. Well, that's so silly, because it's somebody's version of the truth, not the truth, Mr. Giuliani said. I thought that we ought to have an STS 101 class in every university and get them to parse, what that sentence is saying. I mean, what does it mean to say somebody's version of the truth, not the truth? I mean, we all get what somebody's version of the truth is, but then what's not the truth? So Mr. Todd knows, he says truth is truth, and Giuliani said, no, it isn't. It isn't truth. Truth isn't truth. And that, again, is an aphorism for our time. So here's the other famous video, and I'll stop for literally a few seconds.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is.
Yeah, so what would Hannah Arendt have done with that? She wants people, men, to be around who can testify and bear witness to the notion of is, what really is. And here we have a president of the United States problematizing that in really the same kind of way that Giuliani problematized the question of truth. I mean, is truth truth? Is, we're living in this strange world. So all of this has a history, and it goes back, if one deals with administrative decision-making, which is, as some of you may know, one of my areas. It goes back certainly to the Reagan era, if not much earlier. I think that the enactment of the Administrative Procedure Act in 1946 in the US was one of these times when the question of public truth was problematized, and the right of regulatory agencies to determine the right state of affairs on the basis of which you can regulate for the public good, that itself was put in question, and it set loose a number of procedural and other activities that continue to this day. So in the 1980s, there was a big standoff between regulatory agencies and the Reagan administration around this whole matter of the production of public truths. So the peer review debates of that era were part of the set of issues that were going on. Junk science, a famous term that was introduced to criticize the kind of knowledge production that was happening in courts. The 1993 Supreme Court decision, David versus Merrill Dow, that for the first time in 70 years questioned who has a right to bring expert evidence into courts and on what basis. And then in the 1990s, the sort of standoff between my field of STS and public science in a way through what came to be dubbed the science wars. And so the things that we're seeing in the 2000s and beyond are not totally new. I mean, so we've, in a sense, have we ever been post-truth is not the question. Have we ever been pre-truth or in truth? Because truth in the public domain has been subject to questioning for as far back as my interrogations of public science go. Climate denialism is not so new, and debates about public understanding of science are not so new either. The language changes. We didn't have alt-fact in a week when Kellyanne Conway finally steps back from the White House. It's important to remember that though she may have coined that term, the problem existed beforehand. And indeed, the problem existed in polarized form. So I don't know how many of you remember this great work of journalistic expose, but you know, post-truth was equated with a political party in Chris Mooney's book from a while back already. And Mooney is a Yale graduate and, you know, a science journalist of some note, writes in the Washington Post and elsewhere. So, you know, these are prominent young public intellectuals in their own right who are helping the polarization that we see around the question of what public truth and public reason are. And it happens at many, many sites. So one of the many things that people started counting, I mean, Trump's lies are too banal in a sense, and we know the number seems to have gone over 20,000 now. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, counting COVID deaths. I mean, it's an indicator of the health of our democracy. But the days to name the first science advisor was another of these counts that was being produced. And on July 27th of, what was it, 2019, President Trump can add another tick in the records column. This week, he doubled the length of time that any modern president has gone without a science advisor. So, you know, somehow there's a clinging on to the idea that there are these positions in the government that would be able to bring us back to the Arendtian vision of there being a public truth where somebody could testify to the isness of the is. And it's one of these sort of areas of nostalgia almost in our public realm. And when he did finally appoint one, scientists seemed relieved because the person who was appointed was a well-regarded meteorologist. But some people in this audience may know that meteorologists as a profession have been quite skeptical of climate modeling. So it was interesting that an area of science was picked in the physical sciences that nevertheless was about as climate skeptic as they come. And in fact, at the nomination hearings, the White House science nominee ducks the chance to refute climate skeptic. So, you know, there was obviously a very careful political backplay that accompanied the nomination and appointment of this science advisor, and he has not exactly been on the front pages of the newspapers of record since he was nominated. All right, so I want to take the face mask episode as one place where the kind of contradictions that I'm talking about have come to a head recently. In this country, as all of you know, the wearing or non-wearing of face masks has become a marker of whether you believe in truth or not, whether you believe in science or not, and indeed almost whether you believe in democracy or not. And there are different interpretations. And they begin here. To many people, masks represent adherence to civic duty and a willingness to make individual sacrifices for the greater good of public health. Well, what is the greater good of public health? To others, masks symbolize government overreach and a violation of personal liberty. Now, I'm doing a big comparative study of responses to COVID, and this polarization, this degree of polarization has not happened in any of the 13 countries we're looking at, but neither are mask mandates so rigid as they are, for instance, in the city of Cambridge. So in a country like the Netherlands, the mask mandate is far more relaxed and is required mainly in public transportation and closed spaces. And there was a recent court ruling just of a few weeks ago that said that the expert evidence was not sufficient to require a more stringent mask rule. And of course, the Netherlands courts do not have the same kind of political polarization that we do in ours. So it is not the case that all across the, the rational world, we have the same polarization and a truth versus falsehood claim raised in connection with mask wearing. So there are, of course, other historical precedents. I mean, have there been restraints on personal liberty in the name of public health? And there are these. I mean, so there's vaccination and seat belts and tobacco and bicycle or motorcycle helmets. And we might ask, why we accept or do not accept those. And by and large, of course, we accept the first three fairly widely, although vaccination has its rebels, and we can talk about that more in the discussion if you want. Bicycle helmets, if you're in Cambridge, where mask wearing is extremely commonplace, as I'll show you in a moment, bicycle helmets are widely worn. But again, if you go over to the Netherlands, they're not worn because there's a completely different culture underlying bike safety, and therefore people don't feel the need to wear helmets. The same in Germany. So some of the conventional wisdom about this is that these kinds of debates happen because of the public, the nature of the public. That publics are technically illiterate, they don't know enough, and it's the ignorance that leads to denial and to all kinds of other pathologies that we see in the US system, particularly the support for creationism. And the response to that in the scientific community, the March for Science right after Trump's election was a brilliant example or exemplification of that, is that scientists need to learn to communicate better with the public. If they could communicate their facts better, then truth would win out and we would, see the light of day again and have enlightenment, and therefore public understanding of science is the thing that needs to be evaluated. All of that in STS has been called the deficit model of the public. And it assumes that the problem lies in the ways in which we think. And there's been, in my view, a somewhat unholy alliance of democracy theory with brain imaging to show that there are these built-in biases in the human brain that are responsible for the biases and heuristics with which we simply refuse to see what the true and rational state of affairs is. And that is why, for instance, we overweight our own personal experience or the most recent thing that has happened and do not look statistically at things. And therefore, these cognitive biases are the things we have to get rid of. And an entire philosophy of public administration, namely nudging, that was very popular with the Obama administration and also very popular with the Tories in Britain, which should give us to think, was built on this idea of the deficit model and what has to happen with the public. Now, we in America constructed a very different model of citizenship, and we constructed it through administrative law to a huge extent. And I call that the model of the knowledge-able citizen. So not that the citizen needs to know a whole variety of facts and have the sort of lexicon of the facts at their command, but that at need, citizens can inform themselves, and then it becomes the duty of the government or of other authorities to make sure that the information is there. And so all of these rights exist in different places in American administrative law and other kinds of law, Freedom of Information, the Federal Advisory Committee Act. These are all built on the proposition that if you give people information, they will act on it. And I know this hallowed name has become somewhat tainted of late, but it's also called the Jeffersonian model of democracy, that, you know, you give people the information, and with that, they will be able to exercise their own freedom. So the point here, though, is that even within American society, we have multiple models of citizenship and knowledge floating around. And so it's a question, which one is being activated? And for scientists in particular, it's a serious question, which one they should buy into. And it's a little bit interesting that they have so unthinkingly glommed onto the deficit model without ever paying attention, as they have to in all kinds of areas. I mean, biomedicine would not function unless one had the knowledge-able patient in one's mind, because you couldn't have a thing like informed consent, for instance, if you could not impart knowledge and get people to count on that in some sense. So let's come back to masks then. You know, what is so special about masks? And we already saw that people recognize that mask wearing is taken as part of adherence or communal loyalty to a set of beliefs that do not necessarily have to do only with, do the masks protect you or not, and what is the theory of viral transmission that allows you to say yes to that question, do masks protect you or not? So here, the STS idea that one has to begin with is the notion of interpretive flexibility. The world is full of data points. Those data points can be made up to be more than one thing. And how we connect the dots, I mean, people talk about connecting the dots as if the dots can be only connected in one way, but you read in Wittgenstein that this is not the case, that you can connect dots in one way and get 4, and another way and get 6, and it's the same dots. And it's the background principles of how you connect that are telling you, you know, how, what the ultimate finished picture will look like. And in all of these areas of protracted public debate, especially in America, we see that there are these background theoretical frameworks, often not excavated, that produce interpretive flexibility. And therefore, for us, as citizens, the question arises, well, how? How does one reduce interpretive flexibility if indeed some sort of communal knowledge is an essential prerequisite, or at least an associated value that has to go with public decision making? Now, if you have the idea of interpretive flexibility in your head, you can see that Fauci's own behavior has not exactly been unambiguous. So in this notorious example where the Trump aide, Peter Navarro, had to himself flip-flop because it turned out that his critique of Fauci was not welcome at the time that he issued it, he went to USA Today and gave this interview in which he said that Fauci himself had not been consistent on the use of masks. Now, this is something that any good lawyer does in cross-examination. You show that the witness has not been consistent in their statements, and here is Fauci himself flip-flopping on the issue of masks. And Fauci himself agrees. So, you know, in an interview with the BBC, he says, we have to admit it that the mixed message in the beginning was detrimental in getting the message across. So this is another of these passages which I would assign to my STS 101 class, because he's not saying, I interpreted, because of the flexibility of the data, the signals to be one thing. He's making it a matter of messaging. And you see how this fits into the public understanding of science dogma, that if scientists would only learn to speak right, they would be able to get the message across because it's being represented as a mixed message. Then he added, once it became clear that people can spread the virus, then the message needed to change. So that's positing a causal relationship, a linear progressive relationship. As data advances, our message changes, and not that the world is always irrevocably interpretively flexible. And then we have people who may not even know, and therefore we need the masks. So if one wanted to read Fauci with a hostile eye, like a hostile witness, he is providing himself the data points with which to do that. And we have to then be aware of it. And if we want to believe Fauci, then we have to figure out how to deal with that, uncomfortable fact. In the meantime, when asked if White House aides were doing campaign-style opposition research, the White House press secretary said they had simply been responding to questions from reporters. So look at the uptake side. So we learned about credibility. This is a map that shows how likely you are to meet 5 consecutive people who are all wearing masks. And the deeper the pink, the more likely. Now, I haven't seen the overlay of this on red and blue states or red and blue electoral districts, but it's interesting. I mean, one would obviously have to do that to get data science to tell us about co-production and the connections between fact-making and social order making in a sense. But it shows how the production of the facts and the uptake of the facts, these have to be disentangled and they have to be understood in somewhat different ways. And popular culture, of course, keeps on going. I mean, so whereas we had Pinocchio in the Time cartoon, we have Fauci being represented as a faucet, and and it's not only American in that now the idea of the coronavirus vaccine has generated anti-vaccine lobbyists, and they are creating their own, conspiracy theories. I mean, so this is not exactly QAnon proportions yet, but don't give Gates an opportunity because the Gates Foundation is funding the research and that'll produce the vaccine. Right, so all of this, I think, has to be understood inside of the sort of STS theoretical framework of co-production, which says we do not make knowledge and norms separately. And I think that the mask case is one that, in very quick snapshot version illustrates that. So we make the worlds that we want to live in, and science and technology are part of our instrumentarium for making the world. And then some methodological things about STS co-production that we can come back to. But there are moments where co-production becomes visible because there are frictions or fractures, and there are mechanisms through which it happens. So making representations, discourses, identities, and institutions. This is where the humanistic study and the social scientific study comes together, because making our representations, discourses, identities, and institutions is every bit as much fodder for arts and humanities as it is for social science. And the worlds we make are imperfect. I mean, so, this was well understood by the makers of the legend of the blind men and the elephant, because it's not that each one didn't perceive something for real. It's just that they didn't perceive that they were only seeing partially. And I think that that is something that, again, has to be built into our public discourse, that it's not a matter of truth or falsehood writ large. It's a matter of which pieces of the constellation of dots are being connected, by whom and with what mental equipment in their minds. So I've begun to think that The Blind Man and the Elephant is really a story about disciplines and interdisciplinarity. And, I think I want to reread it in that light. So a couple of summaries of things that my research and other people's research have put together, that the ways in which we put things together, these are not accidental either. They're embedded in histories, embedded in institutions. And the idea of civic epistemologies, which in my case comes from long durée comparative studies of the US, Britain, and Germany in particular, suggests that when you look at the ways in which public knowledge is made and justified, that's the accountability, and demonstrated and rationalized, that you get systematic differences which are captured in that table, and that those differences feed into the ways in which we constitute our bodies of public knowledge through expertise. So this I talked about in something that I call the three-body problem, that body in English can refer to the body of knowledge, it can refer to the bodies of the individual experts who embody that knowledge, and it can refer to collective bodies, which are advisory mechanisms. And the three countries I've looked at differently stress these three ways of collectivizing or embodying knowledge. And again, there's a good deal of stuff back of this that obviously we can come back to if you're interested, but I'll just put it out there as a token. It may leave one wondering in a democracy, what about not these constellations of power in accredited advisory bodies and so forth? And when does marginal reasoning become prominent? And I think that one has to recognize that whether marginal or central, it's all shaped by civic epistemologies. I mean, that is, you know, whether you're pro or anti-vaccination, you're drawing on the same kinds of arguments, and then it becomes an issue of how to close these off. And that back of them are quarrels about the nature of citizenship and more broadly about human nature. So one gets these new scientific social movements. The democratic platform that was unveiled last week actually puts science and democracy together as something that the party stands for. And it's very much reflected in Bill McKibben's climate organization, which again puts belief in science as a kind of axiomatic centerpiece, without, of course, ever interrogating what it means to believe in the science. So what do we instead need to do? And I think that until we do this, we're going to have the hopeless polarization that we see between the pro-science and the anti-science crowd. We do have to open up these concepts and acknowledge the ways in which co-production is going on. And it's not enough to insist on transparency, which everybody is doing these days, because, you know, transparency just not address the fundamental questions of agency, doesn't ask, you know, who gets to see in the first place. And of course, nor does it address the other side of representation. What do they see when they do get to see? And how do they see? And ultimately, who decides? So I think that the challenge for democracy theory after truth is to reclaim this territory of public reason, which has been so frayed because nobody seems able to speak truth to power anymore, and to ask questions of a sort that we no longer feel comfortable asking because we think it's been prejudged already. So you wouldn't ever ask who claims to know if you already know that it's the science. And we cannot let that be a sufficient answer. So, and whose questions are producing that science in the first place, on what authority, with what evidence, subject to what oversight, and with what openings for dissent, and then finally with what closure mechanisms if there is disagreement. So this is a radical wholesale shifting of the territory of how democracies ought to be dealing with expertise. There are, of course, precursors, models for doing this kind of thing, but I think that we've forgotten what some of those are because we've got too much into the sort of boxing ring mentality of, you know, my truth knocks down yours or yours knocks down mine, and not, you know, where did any of these claims come from in the first place? So with that, let me stop with the official presentation and open it up to the conversational part, which I always like far better.
Thank you very much for that discussion. And there's many, many pieces of this that I think we'll find will make for exciting conversation as we move forward. Those of you on the call, if you'd like to ask a question, please either notify me in the chat or raise your hand on Zoom, and we'll open it up. Well, I'll begin with a question then, if others, oh, Steve Aldrich, go ahead.
Andy, thank you. Sheila, thank you so much for walking us through what initially felt like a comedy routine with Trump talking about his desire to fix COVID through injecting ourselves with ultraviolet light and other stuff, but then unfortunately turning very deadly and serious right after that. Uh, One of the things that I'm not going to get this reference right, but going all the way back to my political science days 30 plus years ago, wasn't there a discussion early on about in a democracy who actually has the right to choose? And I think that led to some of the early discussions around representative democracy versus a true democracy. And there was some view that if you hadn't experienced something or didn't have the expertise for something, you really didn't have a right to an opinion or a vote. Is that something that we need to bring back to the table in the way you're thinking about this problem we're circling now?
Um, I mean, that's obviously one of those fundamental questions that I think we need to keep on returning to all the time. I mean, so that question, who gets to choose, it's been there as long as we've been creating experts, which is, you can go back as far as you want to go back in history and recorded history, and you will find experts. I mean, I think there were military experts, Daedalus as a mythic one, and so forth, a very long time ago. But starting in the late 18th century, we've been increasingly specializing our public sphere and adding more and more layers of expertise. But really, until the early part of the 20th century, people assumed that you could somehow say, do the facts first and then the political choice. So it was widely accepted in political theory that experts had a perfectly strong right to do the fact making, and the ultimate choice or decision which way to go was to be left to the democracy. So to some degree, when Congress had its Office of Technology Assessment for 20 years, approximately from 74 to 94, what the OTA adopted as a modus operandi was not to tell Congress this is what you ought to do, but instead to lay out alternative pathways and do the pros and cons and say, if you go down this path, you will get these consequences, and if you go down that path, you'll get different consequences. But somehow, both the right and the left have become less sophisticated and not more so about uncertainty, indeterminacy, ignorance, framing, all of these things that the sociologists see very clearly. And it's become, you're for or against. And the way that people are talking about science now, I mean, someone like Greta Thunberg, who is certainly a heroine for our time in a sense, but the way that she's sort of totally committed to this idea that the science says, and she appears before the US Congress and the United Nations and says the science commands us, it reminded me of the Children's Crusade and, how completely committed those children were to the idea of a religious rightness that would guide them. So, I think that what actually struck people as more complex and needing to be thought through, what is the right place of expertise? It seems that we're less concerned with that. And that is a kind of political, historical phenomenon that, it bears thinking about. And I would love to hear what other people think about it as well. I mean, so it's absolutely not the case anymore. I mean, just to round this off, that one can simply say, make the facts first and then we will react and choose. Because back of the making of the facts already is an entire system of choice where people did not necessarily choose. I mean, where did I spend my money? I mean, who decided that genome editing would become a thing and then it would start being used, without any sort of questions about what are the purposes of using it? I mean, who created the preconditions where a rogue scientist, I mean, he's a rogue scientist like I'm a rogue professor. I mean, he had the combined weight of the US government and the American scientific establishment rah-rahing him on. So, he was not a rogue till what he did aroused public anxiety. So, these are kinds of questions that we have to pull. I mean, they're the ones that need to be resurrected again.
I'm going to jump in directly on that question too, to just ask you, it seems to me that one of the real successes of STS was to recognize the extent to which science is about practice and about contestation rather than about a sort of body of fact. And yet, in the wake of some altogether shocking ways of reinterpreting or misunderstanding uncertainty and evidence, it seems that, as you said, both the right and the left have retreated to a kind of naive scientism that seems to have, moved backwards relative to the discoveries of STS in 2 decades of work. Do you have thoughts on how public reason might recover from that kind of problem?
Well, absolutely, I have thoughts. And I would actually begin by criticizing my own community to some extent. So I don't think it's the case that recognizing contestation is equivalent to saying that there aren't facts or whatever. I mean, I think that all it prompts you to do, by the way, let me just say that to the extent that chat questions are being directed to me, of course, I can't moderate them right now, but if people want to address those to me afterwards, or somebody can collect them and pass them on, I'd be totally happy to respond.
Yes, I will moderate the questions that come through chat.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so I think that the STS answer always should have been that, of course, facts exist in the world at any given point. I mean, I use the slicing in metaphor. I mean, when you slice into the world at any given point, it seems orderly, and you know what the truth is. I mean, whatever. You don't stop to, at least to the extent that you don't stop to think about it. I mean, when I was growing up and training to be a lawyer, and also, really until I started looking at chemical regulation, I never stopped to question, how do we know fat-free and 1% and 2% and whole when we pick up milk? And besides, what is whole milk anyway? I mean, where did that thing even come from? Now, of course, I do. I cannot look around the world without wondering, what is the system of stuff that has produced the orderings that I see everywhere. And the example that I use in my Ethics of Invention book that strikes me as particularly irrational in some sense is that we used to have a standard Cambridge, Mass style unregulated traffic intersection that I used for something like 10 years. And then suddenly they put in a traffic light, and now it says 19 seconds to cross that street. It's something about the prime number 19 that has led me to wonder about it. Where did it come from? But if you start pulling at that number 19, you'd get all of democracy with it, because the city of Cambridge must have delegated this to somebody. These were probably some kind of urban planners that did some kind of measurements about traffic density, but who was their standard person who crossed that street, and why the 19 seconds, and what would it take? A fatal accident would change the nature of that intersection. But in the meantime, somebody's probably claiming intellectual property rights so that the algorithm that they use and the data that they use are not actually subject to public view. I mean, so, there's a mini case study in public reason going on in the sudden appearance of a number that regulates my behavior where no number used to be. So, and yet the number's real, right? I mean, I do believe the 19 seconds and typically do not cross when there's just 1 second to go unless the intersection is empty. So in that sense, it is having a regulative effect, even though every single time I'm thinking like an STS scholar, and it's just as well for most of you and your sanity that you're not doing this all the time in some sense. But so the world is full of facts, even though they were made by these complex ways. And I think that the question for public reason is, where do we want to bother? Where do we want to bother unpacking them? I mean, I had a friend once who was a little bit extreme, and she decided that she would buy bunches of carrots, the bagged kind that say 2 pounds, and take them home and weigh them. And then she launched a single-handed attack on her supermarket because the carrot bags did not actually add up to 2 pounds most of the time, and they fluctuated, and they were never more than 2 pounds. So it wasn't like there was a mean that came out to be 2. They were always under the 2. So but do you want to do that? I mean, I don't have enough minutes in a day to go weigh the bags of carrots, and if I buy a box of strawberries and the one at the very bottom is rotten, I mean, I don't take it back and make a big show of it. So, but do I accept the word, fresh and farm picked and, so forth on the thing? So we're all acting as skeptics some of the time and not as skeptics others of the time. And, we have to decide to what extent the public sphere ought to leave room for the expression of certain kinds of interest and deliberation. Now, I think that one thing that has happened in the redrawing of the lines, which I think is an unwholesome feature of contemporary American democracy, is that the forums have disappeared. I mean, part of the emasculation of the regulatory structures is that the places where you used to be able to deliberate are not there, and either no regulation is happening, or people are coming in and saying the science says. And either way, the sort of places where you used to be able to express legitimate forms of doubt and then overcome them, maybe in concert with other people, we've been systematically cutting away at those. The thing called neoliberalism is partly to blame because we're letting the private sector pick up an increasing share of the things we used to do in public. But I think that the route back is to recognize the degree to which fact-making was always a collective normative process. And once you recognize that it is a normative process, not just normative within the scientific community, which is what a lot of STS scholars will stop with. They will say that, yes, of course, objectivity is negotiated among scientists with their different methods and their different ways of seeing, but that's not good enough. I mean, those forms of objectivity themselves are rooted in societal expectations that are deeper, broader, more widely ranging than just the question, how do I interpret, if I'm an orthopedist, your MRI on your slip disc, as opposed to if I'm a neurosurgeon. I mean, those are methodological differences that matter a lot, but not the particular forms of reductionism that we will tolerate, in given domains.
Thank you for that. We have, I think, 2 more questions, and if it's all right, we'll go just slightly over in order to be able to take those 2 questions. The first is from Barry Saunders. Barry, do you want to join in and ask?
I had actually
I will.
blocked off a much larger period of time, but do you normally end at 5? I mean, is that?
We'll go until probably 5:30 typically, if that's all right.
Sure.
So we may have time for a couple more. Barry's not jumping in, so let me read his question. He says, where in your work does the comparative table come from that materialized your framing of civic epistemologies?
That's in the book called Designs on Nature, the Civic Epistemologies. I mean, so it is actually the major sort of theoretical contribution of that book, and it was based on looking at biotech controversies, both in the medical personal side and on the agricultural side in the US, UK, and Germany. And many of the debates become easier to understand, more sort of systematically graspable, if one recognizes that there are these different cultures of the production of expertise and the interpretation of expertise. So just to give one example, I mean, Tocqueville already said something about how we convert our public problems into litigation. But so the idea that adversarial standoffs get us closer to truth production was, has been a fairly prominent, almost political precept in public knowledge making in the US, whereas most other countries don't have that. I mean, so if you go to the global South, the idea that you can ever in the public sphere get unvarnished fact, people would laugh at you because they see structures of power as more prominent. I mean, so we're talking about places like Latin America or South Asia, where there are strong Marxist traditions that will say that the union of state and capital essentially preclude certain kinds of knowledges and ignorances from ever coming to the forefront, because the way that they control the public sphere is through selective fact-making and non-fact-making. So the kind of almost naive assumption that public science works the same way as lab science does, that you have a commonly acculturated set of observers that are facing off and are also commonly committed to finding truth. This was the Robert K. Merton view of the universe, that the scientific community shares this co-commitment because its collective work would not progress unless it was a community of truth tellers. That more or less ignores the entire context of public science making. So if you look at Europe, where there is not the same kind of more left-leaning skepticism of the entire recognition that knowledge is power. I mean, a Foucault would not have arisen in the global South because, in a way, the thing that Foucault was criticizing was already taken for granted in the global South, right? I mean, so knowledge power is just not a thing to critique in the same way. But where this is reflected in public decision making is that it's a lot more consensual. I mean, there's a lot more representation, a lot more recognition that the people who are outliers have to be brought into the system in some way. And, so the book Designs on Nature sort of empirically lays out the ways in which this has played out in different domains of controversy and why we seem, singularly unable to find a way forward. One of my favorite examples here is that we have spent a lot of time trying to get the courts from saying that life begins at conception, because we think that if we made that fundamental biological move, then abortion would not be allowed. Germany has accepted that life begins when sperm and egg fuse through nuclear fusion, so fertilization is complete, and yet Germany has liberal abortion. So, it's the same biological fact has utterly different weightings in terms of public morality and public consequence. And, we're still in 2020 winning and losing elections on this. So it's not, I mean, obviously, I do not want all polities to turn the same, and certainly not Germany if they were going to be the same. But there's a way in which looking at these cases forces us to think back on our own and which moves we're making in the dance of public decision making where we might be doing it otherwise, and where we're just reinforcing the pathologies of the system. So it just gets that much harder to undo, the next time around.
Thank you. Next up is Gail Henderson. Gail, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, although.
Oops, you muted yourself.
Unmuted, and then muted. So, well, first, I just want to say thank you so much. I just have appreciated listening to you, and you Barry had a particular question. Barry's a colleague of mine, and we're both in the Department of Social Medicine in the School of Medicine. And I know you probably know a ton of people at the parallel department at Harvard. And he's asking a question, where did that come from? And you know, 10 minutes later, I'm thinking, I don't want to interrupt you with my simple question, but I will, because you'll take it many places. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you say. I was just wanting to know what your thesis is about the COVID, knowledge and power, and all the, the things that you reviewed, and whether you're arguing that COVID is somehow a qualitatively different phenomenon for us, or as I think you're arguing, that you need to apply the frameworks that you have clearly developed in your work to understand it. So is it, and I don't know if this is a very simple question, whether there's something about COVID right now that's so qualitatively different that it's going to really set up on its side some of the perspectives, your understandings, the frameworks that you've been providing for us during your talk, or that we're just we're just doing the same thing we've always done. We just need to apply those understandings. And it's the particular American context. It's not it's not Germany. It's going to be culturally driven by, who we are here in America in the 21st century. But so I'm going to stop then and see and listen to what you have to say. And thank you.
As you know, the simplest questions are usually the deepest, or very often the deepest. But I'll say, first of all, that recently I was in a review of the McGill Department of Social Medicine, and your department kept coming up as the distinguished comparandum and not Harvard. So there's, if there's a pairing to be made, that one was extremely prominent. And of course, I deeply admire the kind of work that's being done in your field, because it's really, kind of in the center of both society and medicine, which are two of our most powerful sort of areas of collective life to think with, in a sense. So, I don't like being imperialistic about modes of thought and to say, yeah, my framework explains it all or whatever. But I do think that co-production is one of these simple words that if you really start pulling at it and reflecting on what it all means, it takes you places that you might not have expected. So, I mean, I say the world as it is and the world as we want it to be are always made together, or natural order and social order are made together. And, these things trip off the tongue, they sound formulaic. But if we recognize where we're sort of applying this, and that it can be fractal-like at very small scales of production, but also at very large scales of production. I mean, so for instance, we make the climate. What all are we doing alongside it? We've created a thing called climate change. There's a 100-year history, okay, or even more than 100, but now it exists. It's a thing. And what does that imply? We've bought into, along with it, we've bought in that therefore a thing called a globe has to act in concert. We're talking about global governance. We've bought into a set of methods and procedural devices with which knowledge about climate change needs to be created. The IPCC has been set up as a model for how you learn about global scientific developments and environmental developments. And we've bought into normative prescriptions that are really, really far-reaching, that we are responsible for future generations because we're bringing about a set of changes on Earth. We've changed the meaning of stewardship. I mean, these are kind of, fundamental changes and obligations. So it's not just climate change, X degrees of warming over Y amounts of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases being emitted over Z number of years. I mean, that may be the scientific finding, but it's also who we are in relation to planet Earth, and where our responsibilities begin and end. So I think that the co-productionist framework is extremely powerful and just prompts us to be looking for, when we think we're just looking at how did some empirical piece of knowledge come into being, co-production says do not only do that, also look at the normative correlates. Or when we want to see how a normative thing came into being, like political polarization, do not only do that, also look at the knowledge correlates. I mean, every day I wake up and at some point say to my ever patient husband, with whom I've been married for 52 years, so he says they're there in some way, but I say, how can it be that 42%, I mean, and yet I command the resources. I mean, what did they know that I don't know? And so I'm continually forcing myself to do that exercise of trying to understand what it is that they know about the world that persuades them, to be in a completely different place from where I am. So I think that that idea of co-production forces one to be humble and to be continually charitable in interrogating other people's knowledge positions in the world. But then one has to come back and say, but this is a Luther moment. I mean, here I stand, I can no other. I mean, so, where do I stand and what am I going to say if I'm not going to just wave aloft the banner of science and say, the science tells me? I mean, nobody's going to believe that. So how do I reconstruct a world that other people would be invited to come into and, make my world their own? And I think that, to the extent that a Mr. Biden is able to do that with love, he more power to him if he can really succeed. But it's almost like you have to get into that register, not the knowledge register, but the love register, to be able to overcome the kind of problem we're in. So with COVID, to come back to your very specific point, I guess the sort of preliminary framing that we're coming to from the ways, the comparative stuff we're gaining, is that taking a co-productionist look will get us further than just by looking at what our funders actually want. Our funders want to know who made the most rational use of evidence to come up with the best policies. But as soon as you start looking, you see that this is not the right question. I mean, within Europe, you have social distancing meaning multiple things, and you will recognize this extremely well. So some places they say 2 meters, some places they say 1 meter. Now, what is the basis for that difference? We know that 1 meter allows the hospitality industry far greater flexibility, and it's one of the sectors that's been hardest hit. Many European countries really depend on tourism as a major money-producing industry. I mean, so like Italy, which was so hard hit at the beginning. So the 1 meter versus 2 meters makes a huge difference for them. And then we say 6 feet. So everywhere you look, there are these kinds of micro differences. And I mean, you will understand that the evidence does not neatly say that these people are right and those people are wrong. So I think that what we're seeing is that there are 3 disease fora in operation simultaneously, almost like a 3-ring circus. One is the virus, the pandemic proper, and its control. But another is the economic illness that has been occasioned in part by the virus, but not only, because the repercussions we're seeing are partly still the wave effects of 2008 and problems of infrastructure that existed even before 2019 and 20 came along. So the economic disease forum is another one. And then the third one is the political forum. So in each of these 3 areas, today we're seeing different pathologies at work that are interlinked. So just to take the obvious example of America, everybody agrees. I mean, I don't know if you know Harvey, the former head of the IOM, who had a very I think it was an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine, how we can control, come to grips with coronavirus in like 60 days. And what it demanded was a level of centralization that we simply do not have in this country. So without the political centralization, you could not have the degree of centralization that, for instance, China obviously managed to put in place and go forward with. So in order to deal with coronavirus in a way that would enable us to cure the infectivity disease, you would immediately have to loop back into the political pathologies. And all of the data show that the same thing we know from all other disasters is happening again, namely that the people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale are suffering much more than the people at the higher end. And we have invented, of course, this terminology of pre-existing conditions or whatever to talk about this. But the pre-existing conditions are societal and not just in their own bodies. So we can say obesity, but the people out of the Black and other communities who are saying, you can't just say obesity, these are structural problems and they're systemic problems, they obviously have a point. So we're looking at socioeconomic pathologies at the same time that we're looking at the virus, the unknown virus, and then we're looking at political problems. And in that respect, I think one might argue that while it's not unique in its capacity to crystallize the pathologies in each of these three spheres, this is something unusual. This is something that has not happened so often, though 1918-19 may be a time when it equally happened, and we did not rise to the challenge very well then either.
Oh, wow. Thank you. It was a simple question, a very nuanced answer. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for the question. But these are things that when you're sitting home alone, you ponder a lot.
We have another question coming from David Baker. David, would you like to jump in?
Okay, anyway, thanks so much for that talk. It was just fascinating. I'm going to start with a rhetorical point, which I think you'd expect from an English professor, which is that you say we a lot. But we seems to mean all sorts of different things. Sometimes it seems to mean as an American citizen, sometimes it means as a social scientist of your type, and sometimes it even means people who advocate against abortion. I just wonder if what you would do, what if you could, I don't know, thematize or theorize that kind of really shifting rhetorical ground that you like to occupy, and why you're doing that. But here's my more specific question, and it's so simple that I'm sure you've seen it coming, which is, what do you do with contradictions, logical contradictions? In the literary studies, we used to have a gentleman who argued, that when you're a literary scholar in the classroom and you're faced with opposing positions, what you should do is, quote, teach the conflicts. Don't try to like position yourself as the one who knows, but offer the students a variety of perspectives. Well, that worked out really well for a while, but then what happened was people who were opposed to teaching evolution in the schools got a hold of that approach, and in fact that exact phrase, and began demanding that when it comes to education, that evolution, that we should teach the conflicts, we should teach evolution, we should also teach creationism. I'm just not exactly sure how you could co-produce knowledge with people like that, especially when there's something as crucial as, evolution or climate warming or global warming at stake. Maybe this is one of those necessary reductions where you just have to latch on really hard to a matter of call it a fact and then refuse to co-produce. Anyway, what do you think about that?
Well, that's three excellent questions that could keep us going forever and ever. So who's the we, or which we am I invoking? How do you teach conflict, or what do you do about conflict? And what about logical contradictions? And then how does one co-produce? So as far as the we is concerned, I mean, you will appreciate that there is there are multiple rhetorics going on, and when one is giving a talk, especially when one is doing it in this horrible medium of Zoom, one doesn't see body language, one just sees these postage stamp heads, and there is a sort of, possibly vain attempt to put oneself in the same community as one's listeners. And to some extent, the rhetoric of the we may be momentary rhetoric occasioned even unconsciously in me by the alienating power of Zoom. But apart from that, STS trained scholars ask a set of predictable questions, and the who's the we is often part of that. I personally always feel a little odd invoking the we of Americanness. In that respect, I'm possibly unlike many other emigres to this country, but personally, I did not come here as an emigre. I was brought here to be educated and then sent back to my country of origin, and therefore grew up in a tranche of people who did not embrace the we of the Statue of Liberty in quite the same way. So there's always a sort of, resistant strand in my head going on when I invoke it in one of the meanings you suggested, namely we Americans. On the other hand, my very first research in the 1980s was comparative. And I discovered that people were kind of patting me on the head almost and saying, oh, well, of course, you are the foreigner, so you understand what's foreign. And when I wrote The Fifth Branch and Science at the Bar, it was out of an explicit desire to establish authority that, damn it, I can talk about American things as well as the next person and possibly better. So, I certainly use we pretty ironically when I'm referring to my embeddedness in any particular community, including the national one. But I think that the fair point is that it's always an object of analysis in STS, and I'm not unaware of it, but then one does things for the sake of the form, which your field has done more to understand than others, the lecture form, that one would not necessarily do in writing. And, so there's that. As far as controversy is concerned, well, many things that other people take to be logical inconsistency in STS one sees not as logical inconsistency, but as embedded in other things. I mean, so ethical standoffs or whatever. And are they unresolvable? Often not. I mean, this is something that, maybe not resolvable at the level of fact or resolvable through negotiation theory rather than fact-finding. But this is, controversy studies has become itself a tried and true methodology in STS, and how one teaches that is very much one of the things you suggested, that one teaches people to look at moments of controversy as times when commitments that are not normally obvious come to the forefront, because people are arguing about something that they might not have argued about before or never argued about anyway. So if you widen out the lens and don't look at the thing they say they're quarreling about, but look at the wider embeddedness or the deeper embeddedness of the thing, then maybe you'll see things that you might not have seen before. As I say, negotiation theory, which is a field of practice, has developed very much along these lines, because one of the premises I think that you're taught if you're a negotiation theory person is get the group to talk about something other than the thing that they came in wanting to negotiate about. And I think that reflects an understanding that controversy is always embedded, that so-called logical inconsistencies could be about something other than logic, that logic itself to some extent is already normatively coded, and you have to get into what those normative codings are. So give me a standoff, any standoff, and I will find ways to complexify it. That is kind of a mantra of the STS scholar, and as I say, it's a methodological tool that we have in the field. About co-production, of course, if you believe that that there are irreconcilable positions, and even if you, and that co-production is a matter of getting stakeholders together and producing common knowledge, then if you're irreconcilable, like I'm unalterably opposed to nuclear power and you are a nuclear power company, how could we possibly agree? Because I will fight to the death not to have nuclear power and you will do your thing. I mean, of course those standoffs exist, but then there the question is, are you discussing the right thing? I mean, so, you know, maybe the nuclear power people are doing their thing for a set of reasons that do not necessarily attach to nuclear power, and you might destabilize them. I mean, so, you know, maybe they would go in for other forms of renewables if they didn't have subsidies for nuclear, and, you know, that is something that you might actually want to investigate. But co-production in STS is understood in a different way from the way that NGOs understand it. It is not just a matter of getting stakeholders together and agreeing this is a communal set of facts that we can all agree on. It's very much a concomitant understanding that in producing that statement about the way the world is, you are also committing to a set of governance principles and a set of normative principles writ large. So it is not only about trade-offs and finding satisfying moments or things that people will agree, well, you know, I can give up on this. I mean, you know, we have 2 tenure decisions in the department, and one is being offered to this ideological position that I'm really not interested in, but for the other, I'm getting my favorite candidate of all time. So I will agree this time that, you know, this is a fair process and go along with it. For the sake of a co-produced harmony that produces 2 candidates, one of whom I know I will never speak to in my long life of tenure in this department, and the other of whom I will spend all my evenings with. I mean, what has not been challenged there is perhaps a principle of pluralism that meanders through all of American society and says that the modus vivendi that we've all bought into is if we can carve off our own turf and feel comfortable there, then we let other people have their turfs and not bother, but thereby sacrifice a kind of public interest and really an obligation to think about the common good in a way that, say, a Rousseauvian tradition in France might force people to think about the general will a lot more of the time and produce a different kind of citizenship. So I think co-production in the STS sense forces one to dig a little bit deeper. I mean, every time there is a sort of shared understanding of the world, it's asking the question, like, why this world? I mean, why is this the world that people are agreeing to? And I think that's a little bit different from what I talk about as I don't write about it this way, but the Miramax version of co-production, that you watch the film credits roll and it says, you know, Miramax did this and Dolby Sound Systems did that, and, you know, this production company, DreamWorks, did such and such else. I mean, so, you know, that is a different idea of co-production.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That makes a lot of sense.
Wonderful. I'm going to invite Michelle Rivkin-Fish to ask the last question. Michelle, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I'm interested in going a little bit more into the questions of comparability and COVID. You mentioned briefly in response to Gail about how the Chinese have been able to accomplish a certain degree of success in containing the virus through their political centralization. And I'm wondering if you're finding other examples of countries that are bringing together governance structures and maybe the role of experts or expert advisory boards, and perhaps others of these institutions of civic engagement that you're looking at that could offer Americans some food for thought for how other places are getting some measure of control over both the disease virus and the economic and political.
Yeah, so thanks for asking that question. We just began this research pretty much in April and don't yet have very nuanced answers to. I mean, I'm still finding sort of smaller aha moments where I see things that I kind of might have predicted, and that are going according to roughly what I think. I mean, so, but I'm not sure yet because I don't know enough yet. So there's no question that China, along with Singapore and to some degree South Korea, um, that these are success stories in controlling the virus. Um, and they also have very, very centralized modes of governance. So, for instance, in Singapore, there's hardly anything called dissent. And the hotspots that have arisen have been in the migrant worker population, but there's not a discourse of inequality that has leapt up. In South Korea, there's more of a discourse that we don't see because it's in Korean and in their newspapers, about whether this is a time when the sort of centrist and developmentalist state is sort of reconsolidating its hold on power and shutting down dissent and so forth under the guise, I mean, in somewhat the same way that Turkey and Hungary are doing in Europe, that under the guise of a public health emergency, certain kinds of powers are being consolidated that governments were attempting to do in the first place. Of the countries that we're studying, the biggest example of something like that happening, the most obvious example is India, because in India, there was widespread resistance to the Modi regime that had lasted well into February and was allowing for the first time unheard voices to get together, particularly women and Muslims and young people. And this was utterly shut down by the lockdown that was imposed from on high. So this was an example of centralism that was sort of foregrounding the political problem or the political agenda under the guise of the virus control agenda. So successful centralization, I mean, what would one call that? I mean, obviously, it would have to be a quite shaded response. The ones that we might, I mean, so in America, it has to happen in a different way, right? I mean, so what can Americans learn is probably more at the gubernatorial level. And, there for a while, it looked like, New York and California might be interesting cases, but then California has now flip-flopped, which to some extent anyway, which just shows the difficulty of capturing generalizations while things are still as much in flux as they are. But one can point to something like New York and say that after the initial, problems, which were in part policy induced themselves, that a form of expert negotiation and expert information of government that came into being that was more European than American in some sense. I mean, that is more representative of, economists and public health people and so forth sitting together. But even then, I mean, I think the inequality discourse in New York absolutely has not gone away. And the fate of the city is now, I mean, any urbanist among you will recognize that this is seen as a watershed moment about the life of great American cities and, what the repercussions are going to be of the, the commercial sector being abandoned and to some extent the loss of a kind of glitziness, a romance, how can you keep them down on the farm once they've seen Paris? I mean, once they've seen New York. I mean, when that goes away, Broadway is shut down and shuttered, can it come back and what will happen? The jury is still very much out. But I think that the comparanda in America may be more American states compared with EU member states, that's going to yield the more interesting sort of where is it possible to coalesce this three-ring circus of public health, economy, and politics each with their own agenda setting and each with their own dynamics of success and failure, and to produce a sort of suitable collective response. I know that's not a very satisfying answer as yet, but it's as far as I can go right now.
Well, with that, we'll wrap up our conversation today, and we'll all be looking forward to hearing what your new 13-country comparative study reveals about the response to COVID transnationally. Thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with us today and for these really fascinating comments and conversation. As we said before, the video will be recorded, has been recorded, and will be uploaded to our website shortly in the next few days or weeks. And I also wanted to just announce to everyone, of course, that our next IAH Zoom talk features Professors Lydia Boyd and Emily Burrell, both from UNC Chapel Hill, discussing their new edited book, Legislating Gender and Sexuality in Africa, Human Rights, Society, and the State. That's on Monday.
The 31st.
Monday the 31st at 3:00 p.m. And you can register for that via the IAH website as well. Thank you again to Professor Jasanoff. Thank you to all of you for taking the time. Stay safe and be well until the next time.
Thanks so much, and it was really a pleasure being with you this afternoon. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.